Well, I'm pleased to have Barbara J. Elliott with us this afternoon. She's the president of the Center for Cultural Renewal, a resource center she founded in 1997 for faith-based organizations working to renew the cities of America. She's also the founder of the Work-Faith Connection, an organization in Houston that provides transition to employment for people leaving prison, homelessness, addiction, and chronic unemployment. She's a philanthropic consultant for the Legacy Group, serving donors, and also planting partnerships for Kids Hope USA, which now provides mentors for more than 7,000 at-risk children at public schools throughout the U.S. She's the author of 5 books and scores of articles on civic renewal, morality, and faith that transforms lives. Her most recent book is Street Saints: Renewing America's Cities, which profiles faith-based initiatives nationally. She earned her master's degree in theology from the University of St. Thomas and received an honorary doctorate from the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, for which she serves as a fellow. She teaches in the Honors College at Houston Baptist University. In 2001, President George W. Bush awarded her the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights, recognizing her work with refugees and the poor, and she collaborated with the White House Office for Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. She served as an international television correspondent, covering economic and political news for PBS in Europe in the 1980s, and she launched a private initiative to assist refugees fleeing communist countries in 1989. From that work came a book about Christians who resisted communism because of their faith, entitled Candles Behind the Wall. Barbara served President Ronald Reagan in the White House Office of Public Liaison and the Director of Legislative Information for the Heritage Foundation on Capitol Hill. Will you please welcome our distinguished speaker this afternoon, Barbara J. Elliott.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. It's a joy to be here in Michigan. I spent actually a number of years working at Hillsdale College at the very, very beginning of my career, so I recognized those sullen gray skies the minute we landed. But having come from sunny Houston, I mean, the azaleas have already blossomed there, so let me just bring you a little warmth from the south here. It's been an unusual journey that my life has taken me on, kind of zigzagging between places like the White House and Capitol Hill, and then going to the inner cities of America where there are crackheads and prostitutes and people being sold into human slavery, and then going to speak on Capitol Hill again, and then meeting with philanthropists. I kind of get cultural whiplash from time to time, but it's been an amazing journey to see that there is a unity that has emerged throughout really all of history, and that the brokenness that is happening in the inner cities and the despair that happens to political refugees has something to do with civic order, and that people can unite with one another voluntarily, essentially out of love. And that the most intelligent policies written in Washington, and I was there working on Capitol Hill and trying to help in the White House to bring about changes in economic policy, those things are limited in what they can ultimately accomplish. But there's another whole realm of human existence that is only really touched in the private sector, in face-to-face relationships over time. And I've been able to work in both of these worlds. They're both difficult. It's taken me to some really fun places. I mean, I've been in prisons, I've been in homeless shelters, I've been in drug treatment centers. I've met interesting guys who were former gang members. I've gone to a lot of neighborhoods that really caused my husband consternation. And I come home every time, and I've talked to people who inspire me, who let me know that there really is human goodness in the midst of the brokenness. And what I'd like to share with you today is an understanding of the nation that we have and the order that we inherited, and the fragile place that is in now, and the necessity for people to step up to become agents of healing in that order. The title of my talk is Tocqueville's Conundrum: The Way We Use Our Freedom Determines the Health of the Nation. Alexis de Tocqueville was probably one of the most astute observers to come to the United States in the 1830s. So in this early phase, the newborn nation, pulsing with energy and ideas and early successes, this Frenchman comes over, and with the eye of someone who can observe and see things from the outside that for him were striking, he looks at these voluntary associations that are just sprung out of the ground everywhere, all across this new nation, and he looked at the array, civic and philanthropic and political and neighborly and moral and educational, and he was just stunned by this, because this is not what Europeans tend to found. He rightly pointed out that usually if there's a problem, the European solution was to look to the nobility, or to look to the aristocracy, or to look to a large and powerful single church, at least for centuries, to provide those kinds of solutions. And instead, these Americans, these ragtag, innovative, entrepreneurial Americans, were starting up small voluntary associations to meet all kinds of needs. Fast forward the story from Tocqueville, I found myself then living in Europe in the 1980s, and at the time that the Berlin Wall was just beginning to crumble, it was the first time I'd ever really asked God, what do you want me to do? I mean, I'd done all this stuff that looked incredibly important, right? White House and PBS correspondent and nobbing with the nobility of Europe, dinner with the Queen of England, and I thought it was actually kind of normal at that time. But I'd never really asked God, what do you want me to do? That's a dangerous question if you actually ask it and mean it, but I did. And the answer that he gave me was refugees. It was the first time I'd ever really stepped out of my comfort zone. I was much better at going to, lavish parties at that point in my life. But it was at the time that the barbed wire on the border of Hungary had been snipped, and 300,000 people were flooding through that little opening from Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and all of the Eastern European countries, and they were coming into West Germany, which was the only country that would take them. And there were too many for the government and too many for the Red Cross. There were just too many people. And just because it had been put on my heart because of faith, my call was to really just go and help those you can. So I took those that lived in the area near where we lived in Cologne. I had one woman who started with me. And we went and we took blankets and pots and pans and clothes and tutored their kids and helped them find jobs and basically loved them through the crisis. It was the first time I'd ever really done anything like that. And I remember my German neighbors, my aristocratic neighbors, kind of sniffing, oh, that's so American. And I thought, well, of course, you see a problem and you step up and do something about it. But I think they were onto something. I think there is something characteristically American about this attitude of, well, if there's something that needs to be done, then let's just do it. So as I've reflected in the years since about that observation, well, that's just so American, and particularly now that I'm in the classroom, I've been teaching now for 2 years at a university in the Honors College and teaching about the true, the good, and the beautiful, and looking at the philosophical roots and the historic roots and the beauty that's been created, but also what is it that emerges over time that's true. So I've had a chance to go back and put some of these things that I've experienced hands-on into the bigger context of what is it that we are about as a nation? What is it that motivates people to make good decisions with their freedom or selfish decisions with their freedom? And while I was raised in the freedom philosophy, and while I could have pointed you toward the important books all the way through, I'm coming at it now with an understanding that the most important question you can ask in relationship to freedom is, freedom for what? What do you do with the freedom? And there are some very good answers to that. Freedom is the power to act or not to act, and so to perform the deliberate acts of one's own. You know, we are given the capacity as human beings to direct our own actions, and we are then accountable for those decisions. Freedom does not imply that we can simply say or do anything we like. It's bound by our decision and our discernment of the difference between good and evil. We have a sense of the inalienable dignity of other human beings, and if we use our freedom wisely, we will then affirm other human beings in that dignity, and in so doing, affirm our own dignity. Freedom is linked to virtue. We can choose to do the virtuous thing. We can choose not to do the virtuous thing. But the highest fulfillment, then, is to use the freedom in maturity for truth and for goodness. And freedom attains its perfection in the acts when they are directed toward God. And that is then serving the sovereign good. America was this grand experiment. It was conceived in liberty, but it was also very firmly rooted in an understanding of the balance between freedom and order, between self-interest and the common good. The founders believed that freedom can be lived out peaceably, but it has to be paired with virtue. Thinkers like John Adams and Alexis de Tocqueville and Edmund Burke and Lord Acton have concluded that freedom means having the freedom to do what we ought. It means that free people have to be ruled from within, as my husband Winston Elliott spoke about so eloquently. We should be aiming toward that higher good in the way we use our freedom. As St. Paul wrote, "For freedom Christ has set us free." Now, we're all fallible. We were created with the ability to choose and also to choose really badly. So we turn away from the good. All of us do. And yet, there is an opportunity to cooperate with grace and also to ask forgiveness. We fall, we get up. We fall, we ask forgiveness, we get up again. But that getting up again and then doing the right thing is the best expression of freedom. Now, it's a loving relationship, then, that God offers us. He doesn't force us. We have absolute free will. We can resist grace. We can say no. We can turn our back on him. He doesn't force us. But the more people who live within a culture who are guided by some sense of virtue, the more healthy and vibrant and loving that culture is going to be. Now, T.S. Eliot wrote about culture, and he says that it is that which would allow people years from now, hundreds of years from now, to look back and to say that it was worthwhile that a given people lived. And it's expressed in our literature and in our art and in our civic institutions and in simply the way people live, the interaction among us. Well, a culture that was formed in the early American era is a very different culture than we have now. And it isn't just the electronic toys that we have. The kind of hearts that we have as Americans are not the same as they were. And I think it's important to point out that there was something unique that was birthed here that wasn't just uniquely American per se. It was the result of the incremental growth of order and the proper use of freedom and virtue over several thousand years. Russell Kirk writes about it beautifully in his book, The Roots of American Order. Very famous Michigander here. If you haven't read Russell Kirk, you really do need to. The American order did not just spring full-blown from the founders' minds. It emerged over time. There were Greek thoughts, there were Roman thoughts, but even before those were the Hebrew thoughts. The giving of the law to the Israelites was really the first act that created the order that eventually became the American order. The idea of a purposeful existence under God, the idea of a God who reveals himself and who gives us moral law because it allows us to live better with one another. If we're not murdering each other and not grabbing other people's spouses and beings. We just do better. That wisdom given to the ancient Israelites, then to that is added, in Russell Kirk's model and all of Western civilization, the Greek idea of the ordering of the mind. We have the ordering of the soul, the ordering of the mind, the understanding that the inner order of the person and the order of the state are intertwined. Plato writes about this. Aristotle writes about it. There's the understanding of natural law that then emerges from the Greeks as well. Aristotle then writes also about the different kinds of corruption. And interestingly enough, democracy was one of the examples of what not to do. In his order, mob rule is not a good thing, and that's what he called democracy. So, the idea that we have democracy from the Greeks, well, actually the founders' reading would be that's not the best part of what we got. They would have said that the republic that we got from the Romans was actually the best gift of the ancients. Mob rule is not a thing that you would like to have. From the Romans, then, we have this understanding of civic virtue, of the division of powers with the different branches of government. Cicero then understands that our order is really derived from God's law, and he does that in a very thoughtful way. It's Augustine later who, in a sense, sanctifies Cicero's thinking. From this, now we have Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and then we have London. And as this order is emerging in incremental stages, it's building. And over the Middle Ages, then emerged the universities that we have now. The understanding that the places of faith really were the centers of culture that radiated out from that. We have the emergence of common law. We have the understanding that you can have a constitution, you can draft documents that place a civic order that even transcends that order of the king. That was a first. So this incremental birthing of order, then from Jerusalem and Athens and Rome and London, produces essentially what I'll call a tree of liberty. And it was from this understanding, this larger understanding, emerging over 2,000 years, that perhaps a little sapling is taken, and it's then taken across the Atlantic Ocean and planted in American soil, in Philadelphia, the fifth city. So this tree of liberty, if you will, has emerged over time. It's planted here. This way of thinking about things, this understanding that, as Augustine put it, when we live within the city of God and the city of man. We're under two swords. We are accountable to our Creator, and we also live in a civic order. But that those two things are absolutely joined at the root, and that's an important human understanding. So by the time you get to America, this incremental growth, this wisdom that has that layer upon layer upon layer, has finally then given a place to take root in American soil, where it's left to flourish in benign neglect for about 150 years. No monarch, no major institutions of any sort. People lived then in freedom, but with all of this accumulated wisdom that's guiding them. So when the first pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, they came as a free people, but they also, I didn't do that. They were living under covenantal theology. They signed the Mayflower Compact, which is a kind of covenant. A compact and a covenant are essentially similar forms. Donald Lutz writes about this in the origins of the American Constitution. A covenant of the Hebrews set out to do 5 things: call in God as a partner or a witness to an oath, create a people, delineate shared commitment and values, create a church or a synagogue, and then lay out the institutions for decision making. So a compact, in a sense, is a de-theologized covenant, but it still carried the theological implications. The covenant meant that people who lived here lived freely, but that they also understood that the inner order, the guidance of faith, the understanding of morality and virtue would be very much tied with the civic order. If you look at the kinds of things that emerged in those years, it's an interesting study. They had no state to speak of. I mean, they had a few decision-making entities in those early years, as they were kind of the prototypes of the colonies. So if a child is left without parents, or if someone is left a widow, or if there are orphans, they're taken into someone else's home. And very often the person who then provides care for them could be reimbursed from the coffers of that village. They decided that among themselves. But they did that because they had an understanding as human beings, that's just what we do. You know, if someone's barn burns down, you know, the neighbors would be there the next day to help them build another. They gave their labor, they gave their time, they gave their love. That was a necessary part of being just a human being. And it was preached as well. The Methodism of John Wesley said, "Put yourself in the place of every poor man and deal with him as you would that God deals with you." That's a pretty high standard. So you have this kind of ethos then of people reaching out to take care of one another, but voluntarily, because that's what we do. Now they also look to see who were the worthy poor. If somebody is drunk every day by 9 in the morning and stays that way all day, they would be less likely to bend over backwards to give them a job than they would to maybe say, "John, you got a problem here. When you're willing to work, come see me." So they would take people's conditions into account. They didn't just give because someone was in need. They gave to help get someone on their feet, kind of love them into wholeness, and then move on. So the idea that help would be linked to in some way to deservedness or a willingness to help themselves, that was also a part of the American ethos in that early time. So fast forward again to Tocqueville, who comes here in the 1830s and sees this amazing diversity. I mean, there are private organizations all over the nation, hundreds of them. He'd never seen anything like it. So he writes then in Democracy in America, "Americans of all ages, all stations in life, all types of disposition are forever forming associations. There are not only commercial and industrial associations in which all take part, but others of 1,000 different sorts. Religious, moral, serious, futile, immensely large and very minute. Americans combine to give fetes, found seminaries, build churches, distribute books, and send missionaries to the antipodes. Hospitals, prisons, and schools take shape in that way. Finally, if they want to proclaim a truth or propagate some feeling by the encouragement of a great example, they form an association." So here is this flourishing of all of these private organizations, not because the government said there should be, just because people saw a need and they stepped up to fill it. Marvin Olasky wrote a marvelous book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, and I really am Marvin was my mentor, and he taught me a great deal about what to look for in faith-based organizations. So in part of the research, he went to the Library of Congress and sorted through the dusty tomes there and came up with the kinds of things that Tocqueville would have actually seen in America at the time that he was writing. So, a few examples. In New York, the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows with Small Children. That was formed in 1797. In Boston, a Fragment Society provided material for clothes and assisted more than 10,000 families in need. They just give them the cloth and say, "You make the clothes, we'll give you the material." The St. Vincent de Paul Society set up hospitals and orphanages, and they built the New York House of Good Shepherd for what they delicately called fallen women and girls. See, this is a problem that's been among us also for a long time. The Female Domestic Missionary Society for the Poor, founded in 1816, distributed Bibles and provided schooling in poor parts of New York. In Baltimore, a group of Catholic women founded the Maria Marthian Society to assist all denominations, ages, sexes, and colors. 1822, the Presbyterian Women of Petersburg, Virginia, established an education society, a ladies' missionary society, and a Dorcas Society, all to help the poor. Jewish settlers established a Hebrew Benevolent Society in Charleston in 1784, a Hebrew Benevolent and Orphan Asylum Society, and also a Hebrew Relief Society in New York, as well as other societies to assist destitute pregnant women. So you get a feel for the diversity of all of these kinds of things. Jewish, Catholic, Methodist, Baptist, Anglican. The point was, people moved because of their faith, and their heart and their sense of civic duty to form these organizations to help those who were not thriving at that moment in their life. Not to support them in perpetuity, but to help them to their feet, move them toward the ability to take care of themselves, and then let them go on to lead a fruitful life. Americans were very modest about this. They didn't make a big fanfare about it, but Tocqueville was astute enough to realize this is something unique. And it was very un-European. But he also said this. He said, for the Americans, the ideas of Christianity and liberty are so completely mingled that it's almost impossible to get them to conceive of the one without the other. Well, that's changed. Tocqueville did, however, make an observation that I think is stunning. He said that this kind of action has a steadying effect of encouraging people toward virtue by building their character while they're practicing it. He said, the doctrine of self-interest, properly understood, does not inspire great sacrifices, but every day it prompts some small ones. By itself, it doesn't make a man virtuous, but its discipline shapes a lot of orderly, temperate, moderate, careful, and self-controlled citizens. If it does not lead the will directly to virtue, it establishes the habits which unconsciously lead it that way. This is the acquisition of civic virtue. And Tocqueville is saying this was a part of the American soul at that time. He called them little voluntary associations. He's writing in the tradition of Edmund Burke, who had called them little platoons and the subdivisions of society. Today, we often refer to this sector as civil society. It's simply the private organizations, it's families and it's neighborhoods and clubs and communities. It's not the government, and it's not the church per se, although it may be faith-based. It's all of these other things that are in the private sector, in the most broadly construed understanding what the private sector is. So if we look at this then thriving civil society or private sector, if you look at it in comparison to what we have now, that sector has shriveled enormously. And I would suggest that the civic virtue that was being fostered there may have been one of the unintended casualties. You see, civil society operates right at that intersection between faith and human action, between good intentions and good, between people in need and people who can help them to their feet to allow them to become self-sufficient. The government can't do that because the government cannot love. The government cannot serve people one-to-one in a relationship, and that's where the transformational work goes on. This is a concept, of serving people kind of at the lowest grassroots area that is closest to the people themselves. Whether you're evangelical or whether you're Protestant or whether you're Catholic, the concept that it's called subsidiarity is the theological concept. It's the organization that is closest to the people being served is that is best suited and should, in fact, serve them. So, Scottish Enlightenment writer Adam Ferguson called it the moral sphere of civil society. Catholic teaching says it's a serious and evil disturbance of right order to assign a larger and higher society what can be performed successfully by lower communities. So the whole idea that those who are closest to need, that they can see and meet themselves, are the ones who are obligated. And that in the process of doing that, we are forming virtue. The founder's syllogism is this: liberty is the object of the republic. Liberty needs virtue. Virtue among the people is impossible without religion. So we have this conundrum. We want to have liberty in this country. We have a great deal of it. We want to have virtue in this country. I would suggest we don't have enough of it. We've shrunk the sector in the middle that created the virtue. So what do we do? The centrifuge of modernity has been spinning wildly over the last century. And I would suggest that the dizzying pace with which the family and community and order have been spinning out is head-stopping, whirling, overwhelming. The people who are now living in really conditions of brokenness are very often in neighborhoods we just drive by. It's easy. You don't take that exit. And it is possible to encounter people who could not name one poor person or one welfare mother or one homeless person by name that they have a relationship with, because you don't go there. What person in your right mind does? The civic engagement in America was relatively strong, actually fairly well into the 20th century. So from all of these voluntary associations, it continued through the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th, a little bit of a hiatus during the wars, First World War, Second World War, but then kind of came booming back. So 40s, 50s, civic engagement, up, up, up. Until the 60s, 68, watershed year, everything begins to go down. The Great Society goes farther down. Fast forward to the 80s, down, 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 90s, off the charts down. Robert Putnam has done a book called Bowling Alone, and he writes about involvement in everything. This isn't just the religious organizations. It's, you know, the Moose Club and the Elks and the Salvation Army and the Knights of Columbus and Hadassah and all of these various things. I mean, Americans historically have been involved in these kinds of organizations. That was a normal thing to do. And he says that it produces social capital. That's what he calls it. This relational interaction with one another is social capital. And that there has been this radical decline of civic engagement, and that more and more Americans are living in cities, but they are relatively alone, severed from their families, and pretty much disconnected for most people. He says that the fall-off is so acute that Americans are now they used to belong to bowling leagues. He says even now they're bowling alone, hence the title of his book. You know, that this radical severing of all relationships is part of what is unraveling the civil society of America. There was a stark change between the kind of pre-baby boomer Americans and everybody who's been born since. So, I mean, that includes everybody in this room. He looks at all the contributing factors. So he's saying, well, what were the various things? Was it the entry of women into the workforce? He said, actually, that wasn't the major factor because they still volunteered. He's looking at all the various things, urban sprawl, you know, it's longer commutes, so people have less time left over. But you know what absolutely stood out when he crunched all the data? The one-to-one correlation between the absence of civic engagement, the number of hours spent watching television. And I would add to that probably now the number of hours that we spend trolling around on whatever we do online. Something happens that is unraveling our civic infrastructure because we are no longer in face-to-face relationships. Tocqueville worried about a separateness, he said. We call it now in the 20th century, 21st century, this bowling alone phenomenon, but Tocqueville saw that there was he wrote about it this way: individualism is a calm and considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and withdraw into the circle of family and friends. He forms this little society to his taste. He gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself. Well, you add a television and a computer, and you have a perfect recipe for inaction. So, Tocqueville sees that two things can happen. He said, as long as there is a kind of a healthy balance between the impulse to serve, to be in face-to-face relationships, to engage in civil society, that's one impulse. He said the other one is this disposition toward being alone, to be just in the society of the few people you want to be, this pulling back, this detachment from everything else. And he said, and that very often goes with materialism. You live to consume, you live to be with a few people you want to be with, and after that, you really don't care. So he said, as long as these two things are in a healthy balance, there are at least some people who are doing the engaging, and then there are others who can do this. He said, as soon as that balance tips toward the individualness, the material, and the disassociation, we can no longer have a healthy society. He nailed it. He didn't know then how prophetic those words would be. I think we see this modern, unencumbered individualist around us pretty much everywhere. That is almost the epitome of the modern young person, dare I say, certainly millennials. A lot of boomers have turned that way too. There is this culture of self. A number of years ago, Tom Wolfe wrote about the me decade. Well, now it's, more decades plus on top of that. But the pursuit of happiness is expressed in material consumption. How many toys do you have? How new are they? Is it the 4 or is it the 5 version? How long have you had it? How many bells and whistles does it have? Tocqueville saw that this version of the pursuit of happiness was poisonous for the American soul. If it's not balanced out with the other part, he's saying that essentially only the unbridled pursuit of material goods is corrupting. The market economy, there's no doubt about it, has created a higher standard of living. It's created many lucrative jobs. But as the nation has become more intensely market-driven, it has also taken a price. And that price has been in civil society. Markets tend to undermine what makes them work. The element of trust and loyalty and relationship is frayed by at least some of the market processes. I love the free market, but I am also clear-eyed in looking at the fact that some elements of what it produces fray this element of civil society. And there is a tension between the two. Joseph Schumpeter characterized the market processes as creative destruction. We need trust for a market to work, but sometimes it's ruptured. Cooperation is necessary for a market to work, but competition can fracture that cooperation. The quieter personal attributes that are necessary for civil society to flourish are often crushed in the stampede toward wealth. And this really gets to the dilemma. At some point, the human conditions that allow the markets to flourish are undone by the market's success. You add to that then the disruption of families who are severed and move every 7 years on average now, I think are the current figures. You have people who are perhaps wealthy but relationally impoverished. Relational capital is one of the casualties of that. And while mobility is very good for the market, the community is unraveled by each new strip center that comes in and takes down each little small shopkeeper. And it's a delicate order. It's a delicate balance that we have to be attentive to. A growing economy does not necessarily improve the well-being of everyone. It creates a certain amount of discontent, in fact. So, I'll just raise the question, what is it that really makes the difference in this tension? What is it that allows us to keep our balance when forces are pulling us one way or another? And I would suggest that it's our attitude toward it. It's the heart that we have. Money is not the root of all evil. It's the excessive love of money. And the forces that are undone, the lack of trust, are very often countered by what we call sociologically as mediating institutions. If there is a large institution like the government and there are large corporations, mediating institutions are those that are kind of it's like the connective tissue in the body. So if you have nonprofits, if you have community organizations, I mean, the people who are building the small bridges of human relations are those mediating institutions. That was the civil society that Tocqueville wrote about. The problem is these mediating societies have been essentially crushed. It's getting harder and harder to run a profitable nonprofit in a world where people's contributions, now they're talking about even ending deductions. They have to be run more like a business, and people are feeling poor, so they don't really feel like they can give to you. Over time, it's very natural then for people to turn to the government to solve the big problems. Because after all, this mediating sector is slippery, it's intangible, it's small, it's lots of little organizations, and they're held together with duct tape. And, how do you expect this little, unstable, frail sector to actually take care of big issues like broken lives, like whole sections of the city that don't work? And that's a valid question. But I would suggest that it is precisely because most of the things that cannot be handled in the big sectors must be done here, that it's important for us to devote some time and attention and thought to what civil society can do. There are renewers in America who are actually focused on that, and I have met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. In the years between helping some refugees get settled in Europe and then writing about the collapse of communism, starting in 1995, I came back to the United States, and I prayed another dangerous prayer. I said, okay, Lord, now what? The answer was go into the inner cities of America, find the people doing his work, write about them, speak about them, help them become strong, and be a bridge to those in the other communities who have time and resources to help them do what they do. And I'm thinking, yeah, right, yeah, Barbara in the hood. I mean, this is like not my natural habitat, okay? I mean, yeah, I can put on jeans and a black leather jacket, but I mean, I'm not fooling anybody. But I have discovered some astonishing people, amazing people, who are right there out at the grassroots level doing amazing things in building these little one-to-one human bridges. And very often they are the people who were in that situation themselves. So somebody who was a former crackhead is the best person in the world to reach out to somebody who is trying to leave drugs and say, I did it with God's grace and you can too. And who will stay up all night with that person if necessary and invite them to come and live in their home for the next year if necessary to help them make that transition. I met guys like Bob Cote in Denver, who was an alcoholic, homeless guy out on the street, former Golden Gloves boxer. He started a home then for homeless alcoholic guys just like he was. And he's tough. I mean, he uses a baseball bat, doesn't have a gun, just a baseball bat. He makes them get up every morning, and they're out the door at 7:30 because they have to go work. And he's saying work is a part of the therapy. He also gives them antabuse to be sure they're not going to relapse on, alcohol, because you feel really bad if you drink after antabuse. So it's like, trust but verify kind of thing, very Reagan-esque. But they're learning through work, and they're also learning through a different kind of a life, that there is life after alcohol. People who have been in gangs. My friend Brian King out in Fresno, big African-American guy, he's built about like this, was in gangs from the time he was 10. He dealt drugs, he was addicted to drugs, and he nearly got killed by drugs. He's been in shootouts, he's been arrested. It's astonishing that he lived to be even 20. But he is the best guy to now go into schools in Fresno and look 10-year-old guys in the face and say, this is not a life you want to go into. I know because I've been there. There's a better way. And if he encounters somebody who wants to get out, he can actually get them out of the city, which is what you have to do. You can't stay in the same city if you're leaving your gang, and get them to another city where people will mentor him into a whole life. And he's better at that than anybody else could be because he's been there. Freddie and Ninfa Garcia in San Antonio. Freddie was a heroin addict. Ninfa was a cut above. She just did pills. I mean, she jokes about it now. It was like, hey, we were all addicted. And Freddie, one day, is standing in a men's room at a gas station with their screaming child on the floor, dirty toilet paper down there, and Freddie is rolling up and trying to find a vein because he needs to shoot up, and he's starting to shake. And he looks down as he finally gets his arm strapped, and he looks at this child, and he thinks for one lucid moment, I'm not much of a father. He got himself onto a plane, and he went to California, and he checked into a place called Teen Fellowship. And he stayed there for an entire year to get his addiction under control, but also to change his heart. He went back to San Antonio, married Ninfa. They were in a common law relationship, and they opened up their home to other addicts trying to leave drugs. Right there in the barrio, and I've been in their house. Ninfa keeps a big pot of beans she's stirring all the time. You can walk in there any time of the day or night, strung out on whatever, and they will stay up with you, they'll pray for you, they'll feed you, and you can stay there as long as it takes to get straight. And Freddie and Ninfa can say, I understand. We live that life too. And they can say that with such authenticity that it's irresistible. Most of us couldn't have that same kind of an impact, but they can because of who they are. What I'm saying is the people who are having the best effect very often are the ones who were in that situation. And anybody who can come alongside them, strengthen them, bring not just money, but time, relationships. Girls who are having babies and their parent kicks them out and their boyfriend's trying to, coerce them to have an abortion and they're really having a conscience about it. Where do they go? I mean, there are lots of places that will take them in, but how do you actually help people in that situation? One of the dynamos in Houston who's doing that had 3 abortions herself. And the last one, she came back a couple weeks later and said, I still feel funny. What's going on? And the doctor looked and said, oops, we missed something. Well, that something was a twin. And they had missed the other twin. Yeah, that little twin, right, is now 17 years old. And the two of them go and speak. And it is riveting. There is an approach to meeting some of these difficulties in our culture by bringing people who have overcome it with love and with God's grace and letting them do the hard work of leading and welcoming people into their lives. She's got a whole group of women's centers. She's kind of modeling it after Planned Parenthood. They offer women's services, so, Well Woman and all the other stuff. Well, if somebody's thinking about an abortion later, it'd be the most natural thing to do to go to the source for women. Yeah, they offer everything except abortions because she'll say, well, let's talk about this. So you don't think you can raise a child? That's fine. We know lots of people who would love to help you find a family to then raise that child. But let's just show it to you here. And she's got a 4D sonogram, so you could actually see the baby moving while you're hearing its heartbeat. And it's dancing. And you really have to think about life differently when you've seen the movement of that child. Those are the kind of people who are making a difference. I call them street saints. I wrote a book about them, and then I wrote another book called Equipping the Saints, and I keep encountering more of them, but they are all over this nation. And the answer is not give them government money so they can do more good stuff. That was the mistake the Compassionate Conservatism made. It was a flawed concept from the very beginning. The answer is make them stronger in the private sector because that's where they need to do their work. I started an organization in Houston called the Work Faith Connection. And after running around the country and speaking in, I don't know how many cities, 60 I guess, I came back to my own city and I kind of did the Nehemiah march around the city and said, okay, where's the wall down? And where the wall down was on the employment issue. Implicitly, everybody says, yeah, well, once you're off drugs or get out of the homeless shelter, well, you're going to get a job. Well, let me just tell you, if you've got 7 felonies in your background, it's not that easy to get a job. You don't even get the first interview. So we started an organization to take people who are coming out of prison programs or homeless shelter transitional living, or the women's places where they've just had their baby, gosh, what do I do now? All of those are kind of like the front line. Their people, when they're ready, can then come to us. They get an 8-day job readiness workshop, then they get a job coach to walk with them for the 3 or 4 months it's going to take to interview probably 50 places, and to then walk with them through that first year once they actually get a job. And then at the end of that year, to have another person who will help them advance, so they're leaving the $10 an hour job to get maybe the one that's going to be 15. And then a year after that, maybe that's going to be 25. They're making more money than I am now. I love it. These people are graduating. We've graduated more than 2,100 people now, and they are employed by 1,500 employers all over the city of Houston who know, yes, I mean, they had some issues in their background. But in the process of working with them, we teach them, you can stand up and say, yes, I was a crack addict for 12 years. Or yes, I was in prison for 17 years. But I am not going back to that life. That's not who I am. I made some really bad decisions. But I will be the best employee you've had. I'm going to show up on time. I've got a great attitude, and I will be so grateful if you give me this job. Well, if they can say that, and really look the future employer in the eye, it's powerful. And they are getting jobs. I mean, 78% of our people right now are employed today, despite the economy, despite their felonies, despite everything, which leads me to believe it is possible to lift people to their feet and to equip them to function in a market, and we're talking about a market economy. They need the job, but they need more than that, and that's why it's called the work-faith connection. They also need to strengthen their internal life to realize, you know what, the only way you're not going to go back to drugs, or go back to whatever it was you did before, is with God's help. And we just love them. I get to hug every single graduate. I haven't hugged so many felons since I worked in Washington. But you know what? This is the kind of thing that we can do, and we're doing it with no government money. It's where business can actually work together with the nonprofit sector, and they get better employees. They get grateful employees who actually really show up. They do not want to lose that job because they know there's not going to be another one very easily. This is the kind of thing that the private sector can do. And this is where civil society happens. And this is where some really interesting convergences happen. This is where the up and outers and the down and outers get to hang out together. Now, we think a lot about, okay, the down and outers, that's easy. Drug addicts, the homeless guy under the bridge, people who've been in prison, right. Those are the down and outers. But what about the up and outers? What about the people who have more degrees, nicer homes, better vacation destinations, definitely better cars, but some of the people who worked very hard to acquire all that money come home to discover their marriage is really bad. And they've got kids who are maybe addicted to prescription drugs. Maybe they are suffering from depression. And the same 16-year-old kid who got the new BMW for his 16th birthday blows his brains out with his father's handgun. The up and outers and the down and outers actually have more in common than you might guess on first glance. Because the up and outers are also broken in a lot of ways. They found that just the pursuit of wealth didn't make them happy or whole. And the down and outer actually in some ways is in better shape because they realize their way is not working. I hear it from them all the time. They say, well, at least I know, I am a sorry excuse for a human being, and in the absence of God's grace, I got nothing going for me. Well, if the up and outers can kind of take it down a notch and realize, actually, in the absence of God's grace, I'm not doing so well either. And you put them together. We get the up and outers to come and speak at the graduations or to serve as an interview, to do a coaching for them when they're getting ready to go into the workforce. And you bring them together in this space that's safe for everybody, and they talk to each other. And the down and outers can stand up and realize, I'm actually a valuable human being. And even if I lived on the streets my entire life, I'm loved here. And the up and outers realize, in the act of giving them help and love, that they need the same things. They need meaningful work. They need family relationships. They need a community of people around them who are kind to them. But in the end, they meet at the foot of the cross because they know they need God's grace. And that's powerful. That kind of exchange is building up then the Tocquevillian sense of civil society, of people who look out for one another, not because the government told you to, but because you care about them personally. I know that it's powerful because I've seen the effects. I also know that there are far too few efforts like that, but that they exist, and that businesses have people who can either give to them, allow their employees to go and volunteer in them, or who can perhaps think about what social entrepreneurial principles might wisely guide the way you run the business. I'm going to leave you with an image. There's water in the Holy Land, but not a whole lot of it. Any of you have ever been to Israel? It's dusty. It's full of rocks. I mean, I don't know what the sheep eat. I mean, it's astonishing. It's pretty foreboding. And yet the River Jordan is just this amazing, lush, fertile, green, everything's gorgeous around it. And at one end is the Dead Sea. And at the other end is the Sea of Galilee. And there's an analogy here to our spiritual life, in a way. We are given freedom and grace and opportunities. It's like this river just flowing through our lives. We have so many possibilities, and it's life-giving. But if we don't give any of that away, if we don't pour it out into other lives, we end up like the Dead Sea. It's just stagnant. It stays there. And everything that touches it dies. If, on the other hand, all of that grace and all of that possibility and all of that freedom and all of that goodness comes into us and then goes out into the little rivulets, into the community, into people's lives, into entrepreneurial enterprises that help and allow us to love people into wholeness, then we are more like the Sea of Galilee and everything around it that is beautiful and green and lush and flourishing and producing good fruit. And the question is up to you, which you would like to be. Thank you.